The light from the chandelier glittered off the crystal, reflecting the triumphant smile I'd spent my whole career earning. I was 38, a newly minted senior VP, hosting the family dinner I'd spent my whole life hoping would finally change their minds about me. Everything was perfect. The Raleigh house, the expensive wine, the chance to finally hear them say they were proud. Before I could even toast my promotion, my brother, Leo, stood up. That familiar, weaponized smirk was fixed on his face. He didn't look at me. He addressed the room, my parents, the cousins. "We are toasting the family members," Leo announced, his voice carrying the exact calculated disdain he knew would hurt. "To Kiera," he sneered, raising his glass higher, "who Mom and Dad always say is the black sheep who never contributes anything to this family." The wave of applause and laughter that followed hit me like a physical punch. It shattered the illusion I'd spent 20 years building. But the pain didn't last. A cold, surgical calm settled over me. I stood up, slowly, meeting Leo's smug gaze. "You're right," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the noise. "It's time I stopped contributing." I looked directly at Richard and Carol, whose faces were already tightening with confusion. "So, effective immediately, the $7,500 I've been depositing into your account every month for the last 5 years stops. Good luck with the mortgage." The sound of my father choking on his wine, a wet, desperate cough, was the only noise left in the utterly silent room. Carol's face drained to a ghostly pale. I saw the pure terror of financial collapse dawn on their faces. I grabbed my purse, ready to walk out. But as I reached the door, my phone buzzed. A text from my Aunt Sarah flashed on the screen. He knew. He's known for years. I looked back at Leo's shocked, ruined face one last time. They thought their biggest problem was the money. They had no idea my real revenge was just getting started. My name is Kiera Harrison. I'm 38, a senior vice president at a top investment firm in Charlotte. And for my entire life, I've been the responsible one in a family that only values charisma. I spent 20 years trying to earn a seat at their table, never realizing they had been sending me the bill for it all along. The silence that followed my announcement at the dinner was the first real moment of honesty we'd had in a decade. As I walked out, I wasn't just leaving a house, I was leaving behind an identity. The identity of the boring but stable black sheep who existed only to prop up the more exciting members of the family. To understand the weight of that $7,500 monthly payment, you have to understand the history. My journey started with a debt, not an inheritance. While Leo was lauded for his creative vision and encouraged to pursue artistic endeavors in New York, all fully funded by Richard and Carol, I was the one navigating financial aid applications and student loans. I worked my way through UNC Chapel Hill with no financial help, taking night classes and working 3 jobs to graduate with honors in finance. My parents didn't miss my graduation. They just didn't see the need to pay for my education when I was perfectly capable of handling it myself. The first real financial burden hit when I was barely 24. My father's hardware store, a fixture in our small community, hit bankruptcy. He'd never bothered with bookkeeping, relying on handshake deals and a total disregard for inventory management. I spent 6 months of my life, fresh out of college, managing his collapsing finances, reconciling ledgers, and talking down creditors. I successfully saved the store from total ruin, stabilizing it enough for him to eventually sell it at a slight profit. My reward? A quiet nod and a suggestion that I should find a more exciting career. Leo, meanwhile, was praised for having the emotional integrity to stay away from such messy financial concerns. This pattern cemented itself. Leo was the asset to be cultivated, I was the utility to be used. The $7,500 monthly transfer didn't start until 5 years ago. Richard and Carol, having burned through the hardware store profits and a good chunk of their retirement on Leo's failed New York ventures, were on the verge of foreclosure on their Raleigh home. It was a beautiful, large house with a sprawling porch and a deep sense of family pride tied to it. Losing it would have meant total social collapse for them. They didn't call me to ask for help. They called me in a panic, telling me they had a few unexpected bills and asked for a small, temporary loan. I looked at their balance sheet and saw the truth. They were financially insolvent. To save the house and their pride, the public image they valued more than anything, I quietly arranged to have $7,500 a month deposited into a discreet account. This wasn't just a mortgage payment. It was a full financial safety net covering the high-end mortgage, insurance, and the soaring property taxes in their desirable neighborhood. I was terrified of what would happen if the foundation of their lives crumbled, so I became their secret foundation. I kept a meticulous record of every penny. Over 5 years, that was an astronomical sum, far exceeding $450,000. It came out of my own investment portfolios, stalling my own aggressive saving goals for my son's college fund. But I convinced myself it was worth it. I believed I was buying their respect, or at least their acknowledgement. The early red flags were not subtle. At my college graduation, while I stood there with my finance honors cords, they gifted me a leather, practical briefcase and spoke about how secure my job would be. Leo, who had dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, received a brand new car from them to find his passion. My career as a financial analyst was always framed as boring but stable, a necessity. Leo's latest failed project, whether it was a craft beer label or a short-lived podcast, was always praised for its creative vision and artistic risk. At every family gathering, Leo commanded the attention, spinning glamorous tales of near success and high-risk living. I was the silent one, praised only for my neat house and my ability to balance a checkbook. My husband Mark saw it all, his eyes often reflecting my own quiet frustration, but I always made excuses for them. "It's just how they are," I'd whisper to him.
What was truly at stake when I cut them off was the core of my self-worth. I had desperately wanted a relationship with my parents built on respect, not utility. I had sacrificed my own financial growth and emotional energy for 5 years, believing that if I provided enough support, they would eventually have to see my value. I thought my financial stability was a shield against their judgment. I was wrong. I was about to learn it was never a shield. It was a target. My brother's smirk at the dinner was the final proof that they hadn't just been accepting my money, they had been weaponizing my generosity to belittle me. I thought they were ungrateful. Now I knew they were predators. The next 5 minutes of my life would be dedicated to finding out exactly how deep the deception went. The shock of the dinner was merely the trigger. The deeper problem was the system of emotional and financial abuse they had engineered over 2 decades. My parents hadn't just accepted my money, they had integrated my financial capacity into their self-image, making me the designated failure whose sole value was my ability to write checks. The initial betrayal was a slow, persistent bleed. For years, I was the family ATM. Leo's artistic endeavors were an endless sinkhole for cash. There was the $15,000 for the ill-fated craft beer startup that he managed to bankrupt in 9 months. The $8,000 emergency loan for a non-existent medical issue I later realized was just rent on his Manhattan studio, and the countless smaller amounts for surprise tax bills or urgent car repairs. I always paid, and the transaction was always the same. A quick, dismissive, "Thanks, Kiera, you're a lifesaver, but you wouldn't understand the creative pressure I'm under." They never said thank you as a daughter. They thanked me as a utility. The implied message was clear. My money was expected, my sacrifices were invisible, and my success was mundane. This financial drain was nothing compared to the emotional cost of being their designated failure. The family actively cultivated the black sheep narrative to keep me in my place, the one who earns the money but never gets the spotlight. At holidays, the conversations revolved entirely around Leo's adventures. They'd praise his free spirit and his courage to chase his passion, painting him as the exciting, charismatic hero. When the conversation reluctantly turned to me, my mother, Carol, would offer a faint, patronizing smile. "Oh, Kiera, she's doing fine. Still with the spreadsheets and numbers. Someone has to be the practical one, right?" My professional achievements, the certifications, the promotions, the 60-hour work weeks were framed as a kind of unfortunate compulsion. They praised his creative vision while criticizing my lack of spontaneity. I was the responsible, boring one. He was the exciting, charismatic one. This kept me off the pedestal and ensured I remained the provider, because Leo, the beloved star, clearly deserved more of the family's resources and attention than I did. This system of subtle contempt continued until a year ago, when I received a moment of false hope. My father, Richard, had a serious, sudden health scare. I flew down to Raleigh immediately. During his recovery, he seemed genuinely vulnerable, stripped of his usual bluster. One night, while I was sitting by his bedside, he gripped my hand. "I don't know what we'd do without you, Kiera," he whispered, tears welling up. "You've always been our rock." That single moment of validation was everything I had ever wanted. It was enough to quiet the voice in my head that called them users. It gave me hope that our relationship was finally changing, finally shifting toward mutual respect. A few months later, my parents used his supposed continued medical needs to manipulate me into increasing my monthly contribution by an extra $1,000 for unforeseen medical costs and expensive physical therapy. They were so convincing, so seemingly grateful, that I immediately authorized the increase. The truth is, Richard was fine. He was in full remission within weeks. The money, the additional $1,000 a month, was a calculated lie. I discovered this lie 6 months later, hidden deep in a shared family cloud folder. It was a receipt for a deposit, the precise sum I had been sending them every month, including the medical increase, had been used to pay for Leo's 6-week all-expenses-paid retreat to a private artist colony in Tuscany. My father's moment of vulnerability, the genuine gratitude I thought I had earned, was a carefully executed script. They had weaponized his illness to extract more money, not for their health, but to fund Leo's continued avoidance of responsibility. My father had used the fear of his own death as a calculated lie to exploit me. It was the deepest, most unforgivable betrayal of my trust. This period of cold rage following the Tuscany reveal was when the seeds of my revenge were planted, thanks to my Aunt Sarah, my mother's quiet, observant sister. During that time, Aunt Sarah would often call to check in on me. She'd always ask pointed questions about how Leo was contributing, and I would always make excuses for him. "He's just finding his feet," or "he's focused on his art right now." I remember one call clearly. I was trying to justify sending them yet another check for a supposed home repair. Sarah sighed, a heavy, disappointed sound. "One day, you're going to see them for who they really are, Kiera. I just hope it's not too late. You deserve a family that sees you." I didn't understand then, but she wasn't just offering platitudes. She was planting a seed. She was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial burden and Leo's effortless lifestyle. She was my first secret ally, waiting for the moment I finally woke up to the truth. That moment came when Leo used my triumph to humiliate me in front of everyone. The shame he caused was the catalyst. The cold, documented $450,000 betrayal was the ammunition. The moment Leo finished his cruel toast, the clapping wasn't just noise, it was confirmation. It was the sound of my family actively enjoying my humiliation, collectively endorsing the lie that I was the non-contributor. It shattered the final, fragile illusion that my support could ever earn their respect. It wasn't just the insult, it was the absolute, unbridled hypocrisy. Every single person sitting at that table, laughing, was doing so on borrowed time, bought with my money. My promotion dinner, a night meant to celebrate my hard-won success, had been converted into a stage for their synchronized betrayal. I saw the system in perfect, horrific clarity. Richard's overwhelming paternal pride that allowed him to ask for handouts without consequence. Carol's enabling love for her charismatic golden boy Leo. And Leo's own weaponized charisma that he used to deflect responsibility and accrue wealth, all while casting me as the convenient villain. As I walked out, the initial rage gave way to a cold, frightening clarity.
The emotional collapse happened in my car, parked 2 blocks away from the Raleigh house. I didn't sob. I sat in absolute silence, the grief and anger crystallizing into a hard, unforgiving clarity. They hadn't just taken my money. They had effectively stolen my identity, casting me in a role, the unloved, boring provider that I no longer recognized or accepted. My greatest flaw, I realized, was believing my love and loyalty could be measured in dollars and cents. My parents had trained me to believe that the only way to belong was to pay the tariff. Now, that transaction was over. The truth of the situation, the entire, documented, $450,000 truth, hit me with the force of an organizational chart. This wasn't a family problem. It was a complex financial deception. And they had just given the senior VP of a finance firm the clearest, most compelling case she'd ever had. I drove home not as Kiera the victim, but as Kiera the strategist. The first thing I did wasn't to call my husband Mark, or to indulge in my hurt. It was to open my home office, power up my private server, and retrieve my secret weapon, the ledger. For 5 years, driven by a deep inherent sense of financial responsibility and perhaps an unacknowledged fear of being forgotten, I had kept a meticulous, password-protected spreadsheet titled Family Assets and Contingency. This wasn't just a list of payments. It was a forensic document detailing every transaction since the day they faced foreclosure. The spreadsheet was color-coded, categorized, and hyperlinked to every single piece of evidence. 1. Mortgage payments. 6,500 monthly transfers, including bank statements and confirmations. 2. Insurance and utilities. The $1,000 monthly transfer for property insurance and major utilities. 3. The Leo Fund. Itemized lists of loans for his failed projects, complete with the email chains where he pitched them. 4. The lie. A separate highlighted section detailing the $1,000 health scare increase cross-referenced with the Tuscany travel agency receipt I'd found months ago. The entire document was a 5-year narrative of their dependence and my sacrifice. The final, glaring number at the bottom of the column was $450,000. And that didn't even account for the years I spent managing my father's failed hardware store, or the countless gifts and favors. This was the objective, unassailable truth they had tried to bury beneath cheap laughs. While reviewing the file, I remembered Aunt Sarah's warnings. They weren't just the empathetic sighs of an outsider. They were carefully delivered clues from an insider. She had been trying to wake me up for years. I realize now that she hadn't just been checking on me. She had been testing the waters, waiting for the moment I was ready to leave the illusion. Her text, "He knew, he's known for years," was not just a betrayal. It was an activation code. It told me the fight wasn't just against my parents' entitlement. It was against Leo's deliberate, calculating malice. I immediately set up a consultation with a corporate lawyer who specialized in complex financial litigation. I didn't tell her the client was my family. I simply told her I had a high net worth situation involving a structured 5-year debt that was being repudiated and required immediate recovery and protection. I needed to move the fight from the emotional sphere, where they excelled, to the financial and legal sphere, where I was a master. They thought I was the black sheep, the quiet, boring one who only worked with spreadsheets. They assumed my greatest skill was making money. They were about to learn my true talent was documentation. The humiliation at dinner was their first strategic move. Now they would face mine. I was no longer the daughter seeking approval. I was the chief financial officer of my own life. And the family account was officially closed for business. The real revenue stream was about to be cut off, and the consequences for violating the terms of the unwritten contract would be absolute. I gave them 48 hours of silence, not out of shock, but out of professional detachment. The emotional breakdown was over. Now it was time for the strategy. I didn't see my parents or my brother anymore. I saw a defunct financial entity that needed to be liquidated, and a hostile competitor whose disinformation campaign needed to be neutralized. I had transformed from a dutiful daughter into a chief financial officer closing down a rogue subsidiary. The first step was the investigation. I spent the next week not calling back, but systematically building my case. I locked myself in my home office, powered by a strange, cold energy. I wasn't searching for emotional answers. I was searching for objective evidence. My meticulous spreadsheet, family assets, and contingency was now my battle plan. I cross-referenced every one of those $7,500 monthly transfers with the corresponding bank statements, flagging the 5-year-long chain of canceled checks. I pulled the specific email threads where Leo had requested startup loans and emergency funds, contrasting them with the eventual news reports of those ventures failing within weeks. The total figure, $450,000 in direct payments, was horrifying in black and white, but the real power was in the context. This wasn't charity. It was a documented 5-year debt history they had been actively concealing. I even printed out the initial loan documents from 5 years ago, the ones that showed their home was on the brink of foreclosure. This confirmed the foundation of their entire lifestyle was a financial house of cards, which I alone had prevented from collapsing. They couldn't claim they were independently wealthy and simply accepting my gifts. The paperwork proved they were dependent. The pivot point of my investigation came with the expected call from Aunt Sarah. She reached out 3 days after the dinner. Her voice was thick with a mix of fear and relief, like a dam about to burst. "Kiera, I heard what happened," she whispered, clearly calling from a private location. "I'm so sorry. It's time you knew the truth." I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The text you sent, about Leo, what did he know and for how long?" Sarah hesitated, then the entire story came tumbling out. Leo wasn't just clueless, he was an active conspirator. Sarah explained that Leo had been desperately trying to secure a small inheritance from her, claiming poverty. She was reluctant, knowing he squandered money. To prove his dire need, Leo had casually dropped a shocking truth. He knew Kiera was covering the family's main expenses. He told me, verbatim, that he didn't have to worry about mom and dad because Kiera has it covered. He actually bragged about it, Kiera. He said, "It's easier this way. Kiera handles the boring stuff so I can focus on my creative path." He deliberately let you carry the entire $7,500 burden while he enjoyed a life free of financial responsibility. The revelation was a hammer blow. He hadn't just accidentally stumbled into the role of the charismatic son. He had knowingly manipulated the situation, staying silent at the dinner table all those years, watching me pay for his life, and then having the audacity to orchestrate my public shaming. His cruelty was not an emotional outburst, it was a calculated business decision. I thanked Sarah, my voice tight and emotionless. I asked her one final thing. If I needed her public support, would she provide a sworn statement confirming Leo's admission? Without hesitation, she agreed. The emotional warfare was over. I now had an insider witness to the financial collusion. As I formalized my legal strategy, the family escalated their emotional counterattack. The smear campaign was predictable, but vicious. Richard and Carol launched a relentless assault, not on social media, but on the fragile, gossipy network of extended family and church members. My mother's voicemail shifted from pleading to outright demanding. "You've abandoned your aging parents. You're heartless, Kiera. Your father is sick and you're letting the bank take our home." They spun a narrative of selfish rage. They told relatives that I had simply snapped at my promotion dinner, cutting them off in a fit of jealousy over Leo's success. The irony was so thick I could choke on it. They framed the cutoff as a sudden, selfish act, entirely omitting the $500,000 I had provided. They were using the oldest tactic in the book, controlling the narrative by crying victim. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years began texting me, not asking if I was okay, but quoting my parents' lies. "Is it true you're letting them lose the house over a silly argument? Kiera, you're making this all about yourself, just like your mother warned us would." The constant pings and demands were designed to break my resolve through social pressure. But every message only added fuel to my fire. confirming that they viewed me as a resource to be managed, not a person to be loved. The attack escalated when Leo targeted my core ally, my husband, Mark. One evening, Mark came home from his law office. His face was tight. He showed me a text message Leo had sent him. "Mark, you need to talk sense into Kiera. She's destroying mom and dad because she's drunk with power from her new job. You need to remind her what family means. Don't let her take you down with her. You're too good for this financial mess she's making." This was the deepest level of desperation. Leo wasn't just trying to shame me. He was trying to drive a wedge into my marriage, hoping to turn the person closest to me into their own operative. He assumed that because I was the boring finance brain, Mark must be the emotional one he could manipulate. I looked at the text, then at Mark. He simply shook his head, a look of fierce loyalty and quiet support in his eyes. "Tell me what you need, Kiera. We fight this together." Leo's text was his last frantic volley in the emotional war. He thought he was striking at my stability, but all he did was solidify the foundation of my real family. I realized they had entirely missed the point. I wasn't going to fight a war of words or emotions. I was done with their narratives. I turned back to my office, to the glowing screen displaying the total, $450,000. My plan was ready. My family thought they were fighting a war of words and emotions. They had no idea I was preparing to fight a war of numbers, and my evidence was bulletproof.
2 weeks had passed, and the silence from my parents had fractured into panicked, desperate noise. The mortgage payment I had always covered was now officially past due. The bank had called. The consequence was real. They stopped trying to shame me on social media and, in a final act of collective arrogance, arranged an intervention at my house. They arrived armed with their greatest weapon: guilt. Richard, Carol, and Leo sat on my living room couch, dressed in their Sunday best, the picture of aggrieved respectability. My husband, Mark, sat next to me, silent and steady, my anchor in the eye of their storm. I simply let them talk. Richard, my father, launched the initial strike, his voice tight with false nobility. "Kiera, this has gone too far. We understand you're stressed with your promotion, but you can't just abandon your family. We need those funds immediately. You are putting our home, the legacy you grew up in, at risk over a petty argument." Carol followed, the enabling mother to perfection. "Your brother simply misspoke. Leo is emotional. He didn't mean it, darling. You're our daughter, and you have a duty to us. Don't let money change who you are." Leo, the true conspirator, had the nerve to look hurt. "Kiera, please, fix this. I apologize for the comment. Can we just move past this and focus on the family?" They exhausted their arsenal of shame, duty, and false apologies. When the silence returned, I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I stood up, walked to the far wall, and flicked a switch. The room lights dimmed, and the silence was instantly shattered by the brilliant white light of my projector. I didn't speak. I simply displayed the contents of my password-protected file onto the living room wall. This was the second wave of my revenge. The first slide was a simple title, Kiera Harrison's Contribution History, the $450,000 question. Below it, the numbers cascaded. Category, years, monthly amount, total paid. Mortgage principal and interest, 5 years, $6,500, $390,000. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, 5 years, $1,000, $60,000. Leo's failed ventures, non-repaid, 4 years, not applicable, $25,000. Total objective contribution, 5 years, $7,500, $475,000. The family gasped. Richard gripped the armrest. Carol covered her mouth, her eyes wide with a shame that was purely financial. The sheer scale of the $500,000 figure presented on their own wall was crushing. It was undeniable, indisputable, and devastating. I let them stare at the number that proved the depth of their hypocrisy. "Richard, Carol," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned air. "For 5 years, I have paid nearly $500,000 to keep that house, that legacy, that pride afloat. I did that because I thought my generosity would eventually earn your respect.
Instead, you repaid me with a public assassination of my character. Then I turned my attention to Leo, whose face was a sickly shade of gray. The final blow had to be witnessed. You three, I pointed at them, conspired to maintain a false narrative. But the true malice was Leo's. I pulled out my phone and tapped a pre-labeled file. The room was instantly filled with a recording of my conversation with Aunt Sarah. Sarah's voice, clear and precise, detailed Leo's exact words. He didn't have to worry about Mom and Dad because Kiera has it covered. The exposure of the double betrayal was absolute. Richard and Carol turned on Leo, their shock turning to fury. They hadn't just been ungrateful, they had been used by their own golden boy. Leo's face completely drained of color. The mask of innocence he had worn for a decade was stripped away in an instant. I walked over to the coffee table and placed a single document in front of my father. It was not a lawsuit. It was a formal, legally drafted repayment plan for the full $475,000. Since, as Leo declared at my dinner, I never contributed anything to this family, I assume you'll want to immediately return every dollar I have spent maintaining your non-contributing lifestyle. This document formalizes the debt. It requires a down payment of $50,000 by the end of the month, which should be easily covered by selling one of Leo's unused sports cars. The remainder is structured over the next 3 years. I picked up the remote, the bright red numbers of the debt still glowing on the wall. Your world hasn't simply been put at risk, Richard. It has completely and irrevocably unraveled. I took Mark's hand, we walked out and left the three of them, the entitlement, the enabling, and the malice, to drown in the $500,000 truth.
The scene in my living room wasn't just a breakup, it was an implosion. We walked away from the house, the projector still casting the devastating figure of $475,000 onto their wall, and Mark and I drove away in absolute silence. It wasn't a triumphant silence, but a hollow one, the stillness after an explosion. The cascade was swift and brutal. My father, Richard, was too steeped in pride and financial incompetence to believe the threat was real until the bank sent the formal notice of default a week later. They couldn't pay the $50,000 down payment I had demanded, nor could they afford to catch up on the missed $7,500 monthly installment. Within 2 months, the family was forced to sell the Raleigh home they had so desperately tried to preserve with my money. The public shame was immense. They didn't just lose their house, they lost the social standing that had defined Richard and Carol for decades. They liquidated their remaining assets and were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. Leo's fate was the most satisfying piece of the downfall. Exposed as a malicious, calculating fraud to his own parents, his charismatic veneer shattered. The revelation that he had knowingly let me foot the bill while he mocked me destroyed any lingering entitlement he held. Without the family safety net, Leo, for the first time in his 35 years, was forced to get a real job. He found work managing inventory at an electronics warehouse, a stable, monotonous position that completely nullified his artistic vision narrative. The family's financial and social standing collapsed under the weight of the documented truth. For me, the transformation was immediate and profound. I never pursued the full $475,000 repayment. The document was a strategic weapon, not a revenue stream. The true reward was the immediate cessation of the financial and emotional drain. The extra $7,500 a month that had been flowing into their mortgage account now flowed into my future. I immediately used it to aggressively invest and pay off the remaining balance on my own house, giving Mark and I total financial freedom. The rest went straight into a maxed-out college fund for my son. Mark and I took the trip to the Italian coast that I had always deferred, refusing to let my parents' crises dictate my life 1 second longer. It wasn't just a vacation, it was the reclamation of my life and my time. I am no longer the family's ATM or their black sheep. The revenge didn't just hurt them, it transformed me. I am a powerful, independent woman who has reclaimed her finances and, more importantly, her self-respect. I proved that my true value was never tied to their validation, but to my own strength and meticulous documentation.
The loss of their love was the price of my freedom. The physical distance I put between myself and the Raleigh house was only the start. The true journey began after the dust settled, once I was secure in my new financial reality. I never enforced the repayment plan. I could have. The document was legally sound, and the debt was quantifiable. But the truth is, I didn't need the money. I needed the proof. It wasn't about getting the money back, it was about showing them, in black and white, the cost of the nothing I had contributed. It was the only language they understood, objective financial reality. The silence that replaced their calls wasn't a punishment, it was my peace. Yet sometimes, when I sit in my paid-off home enjoying the quiet life I fought for, a question surfaces. Did I go too far? Yes, they lost their home. They lost their public facade. Leo was forced into an undesirable job. Their world, built on hypocrisy and my sacrifice, completely collapsed. I gave them two simple options: acknowledge the debt and repay it, or face the consequences of their financial insolvency. They chose to deny the debt, and that choice led them to the apartment. My revenge was perfect because it wasn't motivated by malice, but by justice and documentation. I exposed the truth they had deliberately hidden for years, but the outcome was still destructive. So I ask you, when a family takes your support for granted and labels you the black sheep, is exposing the financial truth a necessary act of justice or a cruel move that destroys the family forever? Did I cross the line by demanding repayment, even if I never intended to collect, simply to prove the magnitude of their family betrayal? Let me know your honest thoughts on this ultimate revenge story in the comments below.